Hello there! So, I always thought slider velocity wouldn't be worth discussion. It's so simple and straightforward that I feel most people could or already did understand it just based on intuition. At the same time though, last week's endless ramblings led me to think about it more than usual, and I organized a few specifics that I think would be worth talking about. The basics of establishing slider velocity, the logic behind slider velocity changes, including common problems, and how the meta of slider velocity usage has changed. So this is long overdue, but let's talk about slider velocity. From the very beginning, SV, or the speed of sliders, is controlled by two separate mechanisms, a base slider velocity value and multipliers. The first of those is selectable in the timing tab and permits values anywhere between 0.4 and 3.6. The second, found in the F6 timing panel window, permits values between 0.5 times and 2 times. These are attached to placeable green lines in the timeline that modify settings for the section of mapping following them. So like, if I have a 1.2 times base value and a 1 times green line, the effective SV is 1.2, and the section after this with a 2 times multiplier green line has an effective SV of 2.4. I hope none of this is news to you. 1.4 being the default base value on new maps is a pretty reasonable number. The ideal choice for this is the most mid-level value your map will be using, that way the most intense parts of a song use multipliers above 1 times, and the least intense parts use less than 1 times. I would say use any number and adjust with multipliers as you see fit, but the 0.5 times to 2 times range green lines allow is painfully limiting. While I did just say choose any mid-level value for your base, I wouldn't actually recommend changing base SV minor amounts between every map. Like, here's my mentality. Almost all my maps in the past couple years have used a base SV of 1 or 2. SV isn't so much a raw speed value, but rather a speed relative to timing. So a map with 150 BPM and a map with 200 BPM will have different slider speeds despite using the same settings. However, a 1 beat long slider on both of those BPMs will be the same length. That said, it's really easy to get accustomed to a base SV and, through constant reinforcement while mapping, memorize how fast sliders will be with any effective slider velocity. I use bases of 1 or 2 because they're easy math. If I want a 1/2 slider of this length, I immediately think 1.5, then I either use a 1.5 times multiplier or a 0.75 times multiplier. The difference between the two bases is just a matter of averages. On my maps that use generally low SV, 1 better fits within the green line multiplier range, and on generally faster maps, 2 is more practical. Really though, the exact base SV you choose doesn't matter. I'd recommend just sticking to one fairly normal value and getting used to it, since it'll prove more convenient than trial and erroring different multiplier values to work with varying bases. Even when choosing the most mid-level base though, you'll often find yourself needing to go outside the 0.5 times to 2 times multiplier range. I've talked about how troublesome that can be in the green lines video, but I overlooked the best solution at the time: reference timing points. At least, that's what I like to call them. Basically, to use multipliers of a wider range, you only need a high and low value to copy and paste in the timing panel. By switching to Tycho or using notepad edits, make 2 green lines at the end of a map with maximum and minimum SV values. Tycho has a wider multiplier range, yeah, don't ask why. Once done, switch back and you'll never need to worry about the limits of standard multipliers. By clicking on an out-of-range value, then adding a new green line, you'll see the SV is adopted from the previous multiplier, which can be raised or lowered depending on which line was selected. In this case, I chose the low value, so it can be raised to what I want and moved to the correct time with the Use Current Time button. After closing and reopening the timing panel though, this number can't be lowered unfortunately, so it's best to try out smaller values and work your way up if necessary. Speaking of multipliers, that brings us into the second topic, the logic behind slider velocity changes. Over a year ago, I claimed that the general rule of thumb for slider velocity is to map more intense stuff with higher SV and less intense stuff with lower SV. This is true in most situations, but definitely not all, and it fails to explain how slider velocity can have any sort of impact. Let's look at some examples. When representing long musical sections, that intensity to SV correlation is usually correct, and this map makes it fairly obvious. The intro is calm guitar strums and vocals shown by slow sliders. When the song speeds up, slider speed more than triples, as the song's explosive intensity growth encourages. Then after that section, all the aggressive instruments drop out and vocals return. This is matched with sliders about twice as fast as those first ones. While you could argue that the next section is more intense, drums going into half tempo is a well understood indicator that intensity decreases, and accordingly, slider velocity should too. That's why sliders are a bit slower here. This is all obvious, I'm sure, but what I want to emphasize is just how obvious it is. You can see such a stark difference between sections through slider velocity changes, so it more than clearly can be felt by players during gameplay, and that's what matters. Lots of less experienced mappers tend to struggle with making their slider velocity changes truly noticeable. For example, I modded this map a few years ago and it had a 1x multiplier during its somewhat calm intro. When percussion and guitars kick in right after this, SV increases, just not enough to really matter. Going from 1x to 1.1x is practically nothing, even though logically it is an increase and therefore should be fine. Everything in the second section feels just about the same as the intro, so in my opinion, it's a problem. Even after pointing this out and the mapper lowering the first section to 0.9x, it still felt a little bit too samey. Slider velocity needs to have obvious contrast to be impactful, not just changes that technically raise and lower. That idea applies to larger sections of a song like this, as well as SV changes used on individual objects. By individual objects, I more so mean SV changes used to express the intensity of specific sounds mapped by single sliders. Songs full of electronic noises handle SV changes like this most often. Sounds like these are so distinct that pairing them together with the same slider velocity poorly represents music. So you're looking at this, you see lots of speed variation. How are these SV changes chosen? Really, it's just based on the same principle as before, making changes obvious. This map starts with slowish sliders because the bass makes it feel appropriate. On a higher pitch synth noise, SV boosts up. Then on a different sound, SV is somewhere in between those. Any of this sound familiar? If I were to arrange SV with small differences between each sound, it would still follow the same logic, just not nearly as effectively. Like, compare these two and imagine which would be more engaging to play. Definitely the second one, and it represents the music better too. So yeah, unless you're doing some gradual SV changing patterns which are interesting on their own, don't be afraid to make massive SV changes. In my opinion, you're better off going a bit overboard with song representation rather than barely representing the song at all. Readability may be some people's concern when doing this, but you've always got other mapping techniques to aid readability anyway. The last thing worth mentioning for this topic is consistency. Remember Hollow Wings? This is one of his maps from a few years ago. It's a 1-minute song that loops once, which was mapped under a simple idea. The first half used low slider velocity, while the second repeated half used high slider velocity. The song sounded exactly the same in both halves, but the point was to be engaging in different ways despite that. And it didn't work out. The map was disqualified and a QA team member said the difference wasn't acceptable since there was nothing in the music to support such a difference within the map. Just a couple months ago though, that map actually made its way to rank after a bit of reorganization. Instead of following the music differently in each loop, the song was just cut down to a minute and each difficulty of the old spread was split into 2. This was acceptable because each difficulty worked on its own, just not together due to inconsistency. So the takeaway from that, SV consistency in this fashion applies to all maps. Mapping this large section with one slider velocity, then the same musical section with another slider velocity in the same map is misrepresentative and therefore not okay. Same for individual sounds. I used slow sliders on this map, so I wouldn't be able to switch to fast ones a few seconds later when those same sounds repeat. But again, that doesn't mean either choice is the correct one, just that they don't work together. Verucci also made a difficulty for this song and he used fairly fast sliders here, and that's just as valid as the slow ones because, within the difficulty, they represent the music consistently. A long time ago before I understood this, I thought mapping all the new gen WUB songs was impossible for me. I didn't know what SV was right to use in each situation, while it seemed like every other mapper did. In reality though, there just is no best SV, but rather just contrasting SVs to show variations in sounds. The obvious differences matter, not the exact values, and mastering those differences can make slider velocity changes of any kind follow the music and be impactful. That sort of leads into the third, much shorter topic, how the meta of slider velocity usage has changed. This is partially observation-based and partially my own evolving mapping preferences. Everyone knows that the last few years in mapping have brought Camellia-style electronic maps to the forefront of player and mapper interest. They support changes and variations all the time, and for players bored of stagnant ordinary maps, they're fun to play. As these maps have pushed more limits, people have gotten more used to these massive SV changes. That's probably why the 0.5 times to 2 times multiplier range feels so limiting now, whereas in the past, it was never questioned. This shift has also caused me, personally, to find mapping anything without SV changes expressing the subtlest variations in music to honestly be just uninteresting. Like, years ago I'd be fine with grading maps that use one SV for long sections of music, but now I can't help but change SV all the time, even on simple songs not at all like those Camellia web maps. These kinds of choices make rhythms that I've mapped in hundreds of other songs interesting to play again, and representative of the music in a cool way. In hindsight, this may be why I considered this map to be one of my favorites when I was a relatively new mapper. Usually, I find swing beat maps, or those mapped with a 1/3 beat snap divisor, to be kinda boring. They just repeat 2/3 sliders and have active clicking on every white tick, with basic 1/3 lead-ins for variation. That's about it though, because when it comes to mapping, that's all these kinds of songs can support. This map is no different. It's got rhythm as boring as the map you were just looking at, but because the map switches between low SV and high SV for each bass kick and snare drum, and because the map covers each slight intensity buildup and drop down with gradual SV progression, it encourages movement and represents a song in ways that more than make up for its dull rhythm. It's a fun map whose SV concepts were ahead of its time, I'd say, since only now have other people started doing this on non-electronic web songs, myself included. This way of slider velocity usage can make anything more interesting to play if done well, and it's nice to see that this map's creator is still pushing for the same kind of engaging design in their new maps too. So, that's about it. Slider velocity is a more useful tool for map design than people give it credit for, and I think the variation style we just went over may be the new direction for generic maps that mappers could be pushing for. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.